My father refused to walk me down the aisle, calling my marriage a waste. 2 years later, I watched him beam, walking my sister down the aisle at her vow renewal. For the second time. I wasn't invited. I found out through a social media post. But when my pastor saw that photo, he picked up the phone and called my father directly. What happened next reached every corner of our town. This is my story, but it's about more than a father refusing a symbolic walk. It's about how we measure love, approval, and betrayal within a family. And what happens when that private calculus becomes a public spectacle for an entire town to witness and judge. To understand how we got to that social media post and that phone call, you have to go back to the beginning, to my wedding day. My engagement should have been a happy time, but when I called my parents to tell them, the silence on the other end of the line was the first crack in everything. My mother recovered first with a tight, "Well, that's sudden." My father's question was, "Are you happy?" It was, "And how does he plan to support you?" This was the blueprint. My sister, Lee, had gotten engaged 2 years earlier. That announcement phone call had ended with my father whooping, my mother crying happy tears, and an immediate plan for a family dinner to celebrate. For me, it was an interrogation. The disparity didn't stop at the reaction. Planning a wedding reveals every hidden fracture in a family. Lee's planning was a family affair. My father attended every venue tasting. He argued with florists over peony prices. He proudly wrote check after check, telling anyone who would listen that his little girl deserved the best day of her life. My mother spent weekends with Lee, poring over fabric swatches and invitation fonts. Their home became wedding central. When I got engaged, I was handed a spreadsheet. A cold, calculated list of what they considered a reasonable contribution for me, a figure that was 1/3 of what they'd spent on Lee's. The message was in the math. When I asked why, my father said, "Lee's wedding was an investment in her future with a promising young man. Your situation is different." Different, that word became the theme. My fiancé, David, was a teacher. A good, kind man who loved his job and had saved for years to buy us a small home. To my father, a self-made contractor who valued visible wealth, a teacher's salary wasn't a career, it was a charity project. David's future wasn't bankable, so in my father's eyes, funding our wedding was a poor investment. For Lee, who married a junior partner at a law firm, money spent was seed money for a powerful social union. For me, it was money thrown away. I tried to bridge the gap. I invited my mother to go dress shopping, just the two of us. She came, but her energy was that of a distracted bystander. When I found the dress, a simple, elegant gown that made me feel like myself, she sighed and said, "It's nice, but are you sure it's enough?" Lee had such intricate beading. That was the moment I stopped trying to include them in the choices. Every decision became a quiet rebellion I made alone. David and I scaled back, paid for more ourselves, and told ourselves it was purer that way. But it's a special kind of loneliness, writing place cards in your own living room while knowing your sister's entire wedding was a collaborative family production. The breaking point came 3 weeks before the wedding. We were at my parents' house for a strained, obligatory dinner. Over dessert, my father put down his fork and looked at me. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the walk." My heart foolishly leapt. Maybe this was his olive branch. Maybe he'd realized how much his distance had hurt. "I don't think I can do it," he finished. The room went still. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice thin. He spread his hands, a gesture of false regret. "Honey, I just don't believe in this marriage. I think you're making a mistake. A big one. To walk you down the aisle would be me giving my blessing to a waste of your potential." The word waste hung in the air, toxic and final. My mother stared at her plate. David started to speak, but I placed a hand on his arm. I looked directly at my father. "So that's it. You're refusing." He nodded, almost piously. "It wouldn't be honest. I love you too much to pretend." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. This was the man who'd happily walked Lee down the aisle to a man he'd openly praised for his earning trajectory. His love, it seemed, was conditional on a good return. I didn't cry at the table. I stood up, took David's hand, and we left. In the car, the dam broke. The wedding was in 20 days. I had no plan B who walks you down the aisle when your own father rejects you on principle. We decided I would walk myself. It felt defiant and terribly sad all at once. The day of the wedding was a blur of forced smiles. Friends and extended family had no idea. I wore the dress, held David's hands at the end of the aisle, and said my vows with a fractured heart. My parents attended, sitting in the third row. They looked like guests, not family of the bride. My father's face was a mask of polite disapproval throughout the entire ceremony. The photos from that day are beautiful, but my eyes in every picture tell the real story. A story of a celebration, shadowed by a very public, very deliberate rejection. We moved on. David and I built a happy, quiet life. I muted my family on social media to spare myself the constant comparison. For 2 years, I thought the worst of the pain was over. I was wrong. Because that's when the algorithm, in its cruel, neutral way, showed me the video. A video posted by my own aunt. It was my sister Lee's vow renewal. A lavish garden party event I knew nothing about. And there, in high definition, was my father, beaming. His arm linked proudly with Lee's, walking her down a flower-strewn path for the second time in her life. He had refused me once, but had willingly walked her twice. The mathematical cruelty of it was a physical blow. I wasn't just not chosen. I was actively rejected while she was doubly celebrated. But the real twist, the event that would rip this private family wound wide open into a public town scandal, was still to come. Because I wasn't the only one who saw that post. My pastor, Reverend Clark, saw it. He was scrolling through his feed, seeing photos of parish picnics and fundraiser updates when Lee's glowing, floral-drenched video autoplayed. He told me later he almost scrolled past it. Then he saw my father's face, beaming with a pride he'd never seen at my wedding. Then he saw the comments. My aunt had written, "So beautiful. Seeing her dad walk her down the aisle again just melts my heart." Someone else replied, "He's such a devoted father." That's when Reverend Clark put his phone down, took off his glasses, and sat in the quiet of his study for a long time. He knew the whole story. He'd been the one to quietly suggest I walk myself when I'd shown up at his office, red-eyed and desperate, 3 weeks before my wedding. He'd counseled me, he'd married us, and he'd seen the empty space where a father should have been. The next morning, a Monday, he called my father. He didn't message, didn't text. He made a direct, old-fashioned phone call. My father, thinking it was about a church roofing donation, answered cheerfully. Reverend Clark didn't waste words. "John," he said, "I saw the video of Lee's renewal. It was a beautiful event." My father, wary now, muttered a thanks. Then Reverend Clark asked the question. It had me thinking, and I need to ask you man to man as your pastor. Why would you walk one daughter down the aisle twice, but refuse the other even once? The silence on the other end was, according to Reverend Clark, profound. Then came the justification. My father launched into his well-rehearsed speech about integrity, about not being able to bless a union he believed was a mistake, about how this was a matter of principle. Reverend Clark listened until he finished. Then he said, quietly, "John, I've been a pastor for 35 years. I've seen principled stands. This isn't that. This looks like favoritism so blatant it's become a public scandal. And as your pastor, I have to tell you, you are causing deep harm. You are using scripture to disguise a cruelty." My father was furious. He accused the pastor of overstepping, of not understanding family dynamics, of taking my side. The call ended badly, but Reverend Clark had done something irreversible. He had reflected my father's behavior back to him through the lens of moral authority, and my father had failed the test. And my father, feeling judged and cornered, did the worst thing he could have done. He started talking. He didn't go to a therapist or a close friend. He went to the coffee shop, to the hardware store, to the golf club, and he presented himself as the wounded party. "Can you believe the pastor called me to scold me about my own daughter's wedding?" he'd say, laughing it off as an absurd overreach. "Since when does the church tell a man he has to compromise his principles?" He thought he was gathering allies. He was actually spreading the story. Our town is small. News doesn't travel in a straight line. It seeps into the groundwater. First, a woman from the Flower Guild mentioned it to my mother after Bible study, offering a strained sympathy. Then one of my father's subcontractors asked him, awkwardly, if everything was all right at home. My father, realizing his tactic had backfired, clammed up. But it was too late. The private rejection was now a public topic. I was oblivious to all of this. I was nursing my own hurt in private, trying to process the double walk revelation. David held me as I cried angry, silent tears. We decided not to confront anyone. What was there to say? The evidence was in HD for the whole world to see. Then on a Thursday afternoon, my phone rang. It was Marion, the owner of the little bakery in town where David and I got our Saturday morning pastries. Her voice was gentle, hesitant. "Honey," she said, "I just had your father in here. He was talking about the pastor, about your wedding. I couldn't just not call you. People are starting to whisper." That was how I found out my humiliation had a second act. It wasn't confined to a social media screen anymore. It was echoing in the aisles of the grocery store, over the counters of local businesses. I felt exposed, naked. Then the anger came. A clean, sharp anger. He rejected me, then he tried to make himself the victim when he was held accountable. The unfairness of it was a catalyst. Reverend Clark called me that evening. His voice was heavy with regret. "I made the call out of pastoral concern," he said. "I thought I could appeal to his conscience. I didn't anticipate he would weaponize it. I am so sorry I've amplified your pain." I told him he had nothing to apologize for. He was the only one who had spoken a difficult truth. His call was the first time anyone in a position of authority had ever looked at my family's dynamic and called it what it was, wrong. But the moral victory was cold comfort. The town's gossip was a living thing. I started getting looks. Pitying looks from older women, avoidant glances from men my father's age, curious stares from people I barely knew. My sister Lee finally broke her silence. She sent me a text. "Can you believe Dad is so upset about the pastor? He needs to let it go. You should really talk to him." Not an apology for the exclusive vow renewal, not an acknowledgement of the hurt. A plea for me to calm the waters her father had churned. The entitlement was staggering. David wanted to move, to pack up and leave the town and the gossip behind, but something in me had solidified. Running felt like conceding. It felt like letting their narrative, that this was a private family disagreement blown out of proportion, be the one that survived. I hadn't chosen this fight, but it had arrived on my doorstep. And I realized I was tired of being the one who absorbed the hurt to keep the peace. The peace was already broken. All that was left was the truth. I decided to go see Reverend Clark in person. I needed to understand what exactly was said, and I needed his counsel on what to do next. I found him in the church garden pulling weeds. He wiped his hands and offered me a bench in the shade. I asked him for the details, and he gave them to me, his recollection clear and precise. When he repeated my father's words about principle, I felt a fresh wave of that cold anger. "What do I do now?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The whispers are everywhere." He looked at me, his kind eyes full of a deep weariness. "There are two paths," he said. "You can let time bury it. Gossip eventually finds a new target. Or," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "you can own the narrative. But that path is hard. It requires you to speak your truth publicly, knowing it will cause a final rupture. It's the nuclear option." I left the garden with his words ringing in my ears. The nuclear option. I drove around for an hour, ending up at the lake on the outskirts of town. I sat on the hood of my car and watched the water. I thought about all the years of being the steady one, the independent one, the one who didn't make waves. That identity had been a cage. My father's public campaign had shattered that cage. I was free now to be something else, even if that something else was messy and loud and disruptive. I called David. "I'm not ready to speak publicly," I told him, "but I'm done hiding. If someone asks me directly, I won't lie. I won't cover for him anymore." It was a small, internal shift, but it felt monumental. I was relinquishing my role as the keeper of the family secret. The test came sooner than I expected. The very next day at the post office, I ran into Mrs. Henderson, a formidable woman in her 70s who knew everyone's business. She cornered me by the parcel shelves. "I heard about all this unpleasantness with your father and the pastor," she said, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. "Such a shame. Family should stick together." I took a breath. The old me would have nodded, murmured something vague, and fled. The new me looked back at her. "Yes," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "It is a shame. It's a shame when a father chooses to publicly reject one daughter while celebrating another. That's the real unpleasantness, Mrs. Henderson." Her eyebrows shot up. She wasn't expecting a direct answer. She simply nodded slowly and turned away. I had, in the parlance of our small town, spoken back. The news of that exchange would be everywhere by dinner time. That night my mother called. Her voice was frantic. "What are you doing?" she hissed. "Mrs. Henderson just called me. Why are you airing this out? You're making us look terrible." For the first time, I heard not concern for me, but panic over the family's social standing. The facade was cracking, and she was trying to hold it together with scotch tape and scolding. "I told the truth," I said simply. "If the truth makes us look terrible, maybe we should look at why that is." I hung up. The line had been crossed. There was no going back. The pressure was building on all sides. My father, feeling his social standing slip, grew more belligerent. My mother, the frantic peacekeeper, became more pleading. Lee retreated entirely, posting carefully curated happy family photos as if to prove everything was normal. And the town watched, a silent Greek chorus waiting to see how the drama would play out. I felt like I was holding a lit fuse, waiting for the explosion. I didn't have to wait long. The explosion came from a direction I never expected. The explosion was a party. Not just any party. A gender reveal party for my sister, Lee, thrown by my parents at their home. An event so large, so public, and so deliberately exclusive that it transformed whispered gossip into a town-wide referendum on our family. I found out the way I found out about most things now, through a saved Instagram story from a distant cousin. There was their backyard, transformed into a pink can blue wonderland, a professional balloon arch, a catering tent. A crowd of at least 80 people, everyone who was anyone in our town's social circle. And at the center, my father, grinning, holding a giant box that would release pink balloons. He was having the time of his life. I wasn't invited. Not a call, not a text. David and I had been erased. The message was unambiguous. I was not part of this chapter of the family story. The pain was secondary to a new, cold clarity. This was a statement. They were drawing a line in the sand of their own lawn, showing everyone where I stood, or rather, where I didn't stand. But the party itself was just the spark. The gasoline was what happened during it. According to multiple people who were there, my father, emboldened by the crowd and a few drinks, decided to make a speech. He talked about legacy, about the joy of continuing the family line. And then, according to 3 separate accounts, he said, "This is what real family looks like. This is what happens when you make good choices." The subtext wasn't subtle. The good choice was Lee's marriage to the lawyer. The implied bad choice was mine. The speech landed with a thud. A few people cheered awkwardly. Many more shifted in their seats, exchanging glances. One of those people was Sylvia, the town's head librarian and a stalwart member of Reverend Clark's congregation. She left the party early, deeply uncomfortable. The next day, she went to see Reverend Clark. She wasn't gossiping. She was, as she put it, reporting a pastoral concern. She told him exactly what was said and the oppressive atmosphere it created. Reverend Clark now had a direct, eyewitness account of the ongoing public humiliation. This moved the issue from a private dispute into the realm of public witness. He felt he could no longer stay silent from the pulpit. He didn't name names. But that Sunday, his sermon was on the parable of the prodigal son, with a focus he'd never taken before. He spoke about the older brother, the one who stayed home, obeyed the rules, and yet felt unseen and unloved. He talked about the father's duty to celebrate both sons and the poison of conditional love. He talked about how sometimes the most painful rejection happens not in a far-off country, but in the family home, in front of everyone. The congregation was stone silent. Everyone knew exactly who he was talking about. My father, who had not attended church that day, heard about it before lunch. This was the turning point. The town now had a shared, sanctioned language for what was happening. It wasn't just gossip anymore. It was a moral failing discussed in the framework of Sunday scripture. Sides began to harden. A group of my parents' friends closed ranks around them, dismissing the criticism as political correctness and attacking a good man. But a larger, quieter group, people who had always found my father showy and judgmental, mothers who remembered me as a quiet kid, folks who valued the pastor, began a quiet boycott. It started small. My father's contracting business saw 3 planned projects postponed indefinitely. Deciding to renovate later, they said. My mother found her usual leadership role in the summer festival quietly reassigned to a co-chair. They were being ostracized not with shouts, but with silence and withdrawn opportunities. This economic and social pressure made my father furious and my mother despondent. They blamed me. I received a blistering email from my father, accusing me of turning the town against them, of using the pastor as a weapon to destroy his reputation. He ended it with, "You have won. I hope you're happy." He saw it as a battle I was waging. I wasn't waging anything. I was just existing, and the truth of his actions had its own consequence. Then the unthinkable happened. My sister Lee called me. She was crying, not sad tears, but angry, frustrated ones. "You have to fix this," she demanded. "Dad's business is hurting. Mom is a mess. People are being so nasty to us online. You need to tell everyone it's not a big deal, that you're fine, that the pastor misunderstood." The sheer audacity took my breath away. In her mind, I was the malfunction that needed to be corrected so their perfect world could resume. The vow renewal, the gender reveal, the years of favoritism, none of that was the problem. The problem was that I had stopped playing my part as the contented background character. "Lee," I said, my voice calm and foreign to my own ears. "He walked you down the aisle twice. He threw you a party for a baby's gender. He called my marriage a waste. He gave a speech implying I made bad choices. And you want me to fix it by telling everyone I'm fine? I am not fine. And the only people who need to fix anything are the ones who broke it." She hung up on me. That was the last time we spoke. The schism was complete, but the town's judgment was still playing out. The final, most surreal escalation came from the local online community forum, a notoriously fiery page where people debated property taxes and lost pets. Someone anonymously started a thread. The title was, "The Carpenter and the Pastor, a Modern Parable." It laid out the entire saga with thinly veiled pseudonyms. The post was factual, detailed, and brutally fair. It included the wedding refusal, the vow renewal video, the pastor's call, the coffee shop gossip, the gender reveal speech, and the sermon. It didn't take sides. It just asked, what does our community owe to truth? And what do we do when a respected man's private actions conflict so starkly with public morality? The thread exploded, hundreds of comments. Some defended my father's right to his opinion, but most expressed dismay, sadness, and a surprising amount of support for me. People I hadn't spoken to in years messaged me privately to offer kind words. The story was now a fully public, documented artifact. It had a life of its own. My private hurt was now a civic drama. I felt utterly exposed, yet strangely liberated. The secret was gone. The pretense was obliterated. There was no more family business to protect. The damage was done, and it was spectacular. In the wreckage, I found a terrible kind of freedom. I finally understood that I had been seeking approval from a court that had already ruled against me. Their verdict was in their actions, repeated and recorded for all to see. I sat down with David and Reverend Clark. It was time to decide what to do with this freedom. The path of silence was gone. The path of nuclear public confrontation was upon us, but I didn't want to just add more noise to the fire. Reverend Clark had a suggestion. It was radical. It was terrifying. And it would force the whole town and my family to finally look at what they had helped create. He proposed a public reconciliation forum. Not between me and my father. That bridge was ashes. But a community conversation about favoritism, forgiveness, and the scars families leave. He wanted me to speak. To tell my story not as gossip, but as testimony. The idea of speaking in front of the town terrified me. But the thought of staying silent, of letting their narrative be the final word, terrified me more. I told Reverend Clark yes. We planned it not as a confrontation, but as a testimony. He called it an evening of truth and healing. It would be held in the church fellowship hall, open to anyone. He would give a brief introduction about the power of story, then I would speak, and then there would be time for open, moderated sharing from the community. The focus, he insisted, would be on the broader themes, not just my family's saga. But everyone knew the catalyst. The week before the forum was the longest of my life. My father got word of it. He sent a final, scorched earth email, disowning me in all but legal terms, calling me a traitor and a performer. My mother called, weeping, begging me to cancel, saying I would destroy the family forever. Her pain was real, but it was the pain of someone watching a diseased limb finally be amputated, necessary but devastating. I held firm. David was my rock, rehearsing with me, reminding me to breathe. The night arrived. I expected a handful of curious busybodies. Instead, the fellowship hall was packed. Every folding chair was taken, people stood along the walls. I saw faces from every part of my life, teachers, old friends, parents of friends, store owners, and yes, the curious gossips. My family was notably absent. The air was thick with a tense, reverent silence. Reverend Clark gave his introduction, framing the night as a chance to examine how families hurt and heal. Then he nodded to me. I walked to the simple lectern, my notes trembling in my hands. I looked out at the sea of faces, took a deep breath, and began. I didn't start with a wedding. I started with a little girl learning to get her own bandage. I talked about the quiet, daily lessons of being the independent one. I talked about the bus rides, the second-hand clothes, the scholarship applications filled out alone at the kitchen table. I painted the pattern, not with anger, but with the sad clarity of hindsight. Then I brought them to the wedding. I described the feeling of the silk of my dress under my fingertips as I walked alone, the weight of my father's absence like a physical force. I recited his word, waste. Then I told them about the video, the shock of seeing the double walk, the pastor's call, the gender reveal speech. I told them about the whispers in the post office, the crushing pressure to pretend everything was fine to preserve a family image that had never included me as a full member. My voice shook at times, but it didn't break. I was simply bearing witness. I ended not with blame, but with a question. I'm here tonight not to condemn my family, but to ask, how many of us have played a role in stories like this? The one who favors, the one who is favored, the one who stands by silently, or the one who is told to swallow their pain to keep the peace. This isn't just my story. It's the story of what happens when love becomes a transaction, with some accounts valued more than others. When I finished, there was no applause, just a deep, collective exhale, followed by a silence that felt sacred. Then Reverend Clark opened the floor. What happened next changed everything. One by one, people stood. A man in his 60s talked about being the unfavored son, still nursing wounds from 50 years ago. A young woman spoke through tears about her mother always praising her sister's achievements while dismissing hers. A grandmother admitted she'd favored one grandchild and was only now seeing the damage. Story after story poured out, a chorus of silent pain finally finding a voice. My specific story had become a universal key, unlocking a vault of hidden family grief in our community. My father's allies did not speak. They sat stiffly or had not come. The forum didn't change their minds, but it did something more important. It changed the community's mind about what was acceptable to discuss. It stripped the shame away from being the less loved child. The aftermath was complex. The forum video was recorded and, with my permission, shared on the church's private page. It was viewed hundreds of times. I received dozens of messages, not of gossip, but of thanks. You told my story, many wrote. My father's business never fully recovered its local standing. He took on more projects in neighboring towns. My mother retreated from most community activities. Lee had her baby, and the photos were shared within a very small, insulated circle. The grand public celebrations for that branch of the family were over. They lived in a smaller, quieter world of their own making. For me, the rupture was complete, but the bleeding stopped. The open wound finally scarred over. David and I grew closer, our marriage fortified in the furnace of all that pressure. I started volunteering with a youth mentorship program, talking to kids about self-worth that isn't tied to parental approval. The most surprising detail came almost a year later. A letter arrived with no return address. The handwriting was my father's. My hands shook as I opened it. It wasn't an apology. It was a newspaper clipping, an article about a local tradesman winning a regional contract for a large community center project. He had circled his company name in the article. Attached was a sticky note with just 3 words in his familiar, jagged script. I built this. I stared at it for a long time. It was not forgiveness. It was not love. It was a statement. It was him saying, see, I am still a builder. I am still successful even without you, even after everything. It was the final piece of the puzzle. I realized he would never understand the emotional architecture he had failed to build. He could only point to the physical structures he could measure and put his name on. I felt a final, quiet release. The need for him to understand evaporated. I put the clipping in a drawer. I didn't need to keep it or throw it away. It just was. The town eventually moved on to new dramas, but a subtle shift remained. People checked in on each other a little more. Conversations about family became a bit more honest. Reverend Clark began holding annual forums on difficult topics. The scar tissue of our community was thicker, but perhaps stronger. So, what happened when the pastor called my father? It didn't bring us reconciliation. It didn't force a happy ending. It started a chain reaction that exposed a hidden fault line in our family, and in doing so, held up a mirror to our entire town. It proved that some wounds must be aired before they can heal, even if the healing means accepting a new shape for your life, one you never planned for. The father who refused to walk me down the aisle, who called my marriage a waste, never did apologize. He never will. But he also never got to define the story alone. His refusal was the first note, but it wasn't the last. The last notes were the stories shared in that fellowship hall, the quiet acts of rebuilding a life on my own terms, and the hard one understanding that some silences need to be broken, no matter the cost. So where does that leave us? With a simple, difficult truth. Love should not be a limited resource in a family. A parent's approval should not be a prize won only by the child whose life best mirrors their own unfulfilled dreams or social ambitions. What my father called principle was, in the end, just a prettier word for a ledger sheet, one where my value was assessed and found wanting. This story was never about a walk down an aisle. It was about the miles we walk alone after being told we aren't worth the short, symbolic stroll. It was about the quiet math of favoritism that children feel in their bones long before they can name it. And it was about what happens when that private math gets audited in the public square. Some people will hear this and think it's about revenge. It was. Revenge would have been wanting him to hurt as I hurt. What I wanted, what I think so many of us in these situations want, was simply for the reality of the hurt to be acknowledged, for the record to show what actually happened. When that was impossible within the family, it happened within the community. The truth, once released, finds its own level. If you are holding a similar hurt, a ledger of your own where you always seem to come up short, I won't tell you to confront your family or speak to your town. That is a path you must choose for yourself if you choose it at all. But I will tell you this, you are not crazy. The patterns you see are real. The imbalance you feel is valid. You can stop begging for a love that was designed from the beginning to be conditional. You can stop auditing yourself for flaws to explain their absence. You can build a table of your own and surround it with people who choose a seat there, not out of obligation, but out of genuine desire. My story didn't have the movie-ending reconciliation. It had something more real, a quiet, steadfast life built beside the wreckage, a marriage that is a daily choice, not a performance, a chosen family that shows up, a peace that comes from releasing the hope that the people who broke you will also be the ones to heal you. The pastor's phone call didn't fix my family. It broke it open. And from those broken pieces, I had to build something new. That is the final, unspoken step in any story like this. Not the victory of being vindicated, but the harder, quieter work of building a life beautiful enough to make the vindication matter. Thank you for listening to my story. If this resonated with you, if you've ever stood at your own altar or your own graduation or your own quiet Tuesday night wondering why you were the one asked to be so strong, you're not alone. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories that explore the real, raw, and resilient corners of the human heart. I'm here, walking this path with you.